just even in my life, I tried to just do everything the most efficient way possible.
Because the key now is like you've got to that level, and that's awesome. Let's keep you here.
In Counter-Strike, so many of the things are in the timing, right? Sometimes 1 second is way too much.
Because I feel like some of my persona in Counter-Strike changed who I was as a person.
Oh, what? Jumping double for gold!
Okay, welcome back to the DDK show. Today we'll be doing another solo episode. A few people have actually requested that I do more solo episodes, so I actually appreciate that because sometimes, it's I'm in a position where I'm thinking to myself, it's people don't want to hear me talk just by myself. The value is the guest, But it's good to know that some people do like these, and we will be going and covering today questions that I received on Twitter. I made a call to action asking you guys for any questions that you may have relating to performance. And, I want to address those issues on my podcast. And it should be quite fun. So let's get started. The first question is from Eric Stromberg. Some of you may know him as Debez. And he asks, caffeine. I've always taken caffeine when gaming my entire career, but I have high levels of anxiety when under pressure. Could people similar to me actually be at a disadvantage taking energy supplements before matches? Now, I have to say that caffeine is definitely a wonder drug in many senses. It can definitely help with alertness, focus, and prevent you from feeling as tired as opposed to waking you up. It's more about preventing you from becoming more tired and also kind of giving you some more focus. But it does actually have an effect to increase anxiety in some people, depending on the dosages. And obviously, everybody has vastly different physiologies. So it's one of those things where you really have to feel it out. One thing that I have stacked with caffeine, which has been pretty effective for me, is L-theanine. If you're going to go that nootropic route, and I suppose you are with the caffeine in the first place. And so those are two things that work for many people together to basically counteract the side effects that aren't as desirable on caffeine to give you a longer lasting focus and alertness. So that's something to try. And if the L-theanine thing doesn't work, it could just be that you're more prone to getting anxiety in general, or in general from taking something like caffeine. So I would imagine what would be a good course of action would be to actually completely abstain. If you've never tried doing that, it could be very worth it to effectively understand what the impact is. Unfortunately, there is no one answer because our bodies are all different. So experimentation is key. We've got to kind of treat ourselves as human guinea pigs sometimes. So I think for you, Eric, those would be the two suggestions I would go towards. But for anybody else interested, definitely check out caffeine. If you're someone that always consumes caffeine, try throwing in some L-theanine, some high quality L-theanine in there as well, and do some research as well. Make sure that before you take anything, and even if it is as potentially inert as something like L-theanine, make sure that you research it. And I'm not a doctor. I'm not trying to give medical advice, but it is just a nootropic, a supplement. But make sure that you practice, make sure you have good thinking practices and take things seriously in that sense, and don't be lazy. Whatever you're doing, make sure you try to understand it as best you can, and experiment. Right. So the next question is from Wavepunk, Caleb Simmons, someone I've worked with before. He's hosted a bunch of Twitch rivals. Amazing guy, very musically gifted. So check his Twitter out at WavepunkRL. Rocket League is his main domain. But he asks, how do players in a grand finals avoid getting overwhelmed by the gravitas of the stakes of the match and just play the game like normal? Now, I think a lot of athletes have different methodologies in terms of how they manage pressure, and some people just take the basic approach, which is just keep doing it, and eventually maybe it works for you. Unfortunately, as rough as that sounds, that is the approach of many. And some people adapt well and some people don't. And some people take to it like a duck to water immediately. And on a stage, their first stage appearance, they'll just be great. And the pressure really, they thrive in pressure, and they really feed off of it to effectively make them an even better performer than they could be anywhere else. And for some people, it completely destroys them and it takes them a long time to adapt. There are definitely a lot of tricks, I suppose, and ways you can work on it. One of those is that, a practice that, you always are understanding that you're doing a job, like you're there specifically for a reason. You're one of the best at the world in what you do, and you're doing a job. And in your preparation for that match, you understand better what that job is. Like when you're in a match, when you're in any one scenario, you have a list of things to do. Especially if it's a team game, and just putting yourself in the best position to be as focused as possible on each particular task. I was trying to isolate, those tasks away from the greater meaning, and to understand that what you're doing is just, exercising your craft, exercising your preparation and your practice. Then you'll probably that in of itself is a pretty good start, and that can get you pretty far. Obviously, as stakes rise, as you go into new territory in terms of maybe it's not just a stage match, maybe it's the semifinals, the grand finals, maybe it's a qualification match, whatever it might be, something that you're not used to. It can take an adjustment period for some people. And for some people, some of the way that you take off the edge is just by having the experience of doing it. And that repetition for some people is needed, unfortunately. And that repetition gives you the idea that in your head that I've done this before, it's not so scary. I've seen the other side, it's not so scary. I'm not going to get, let's say, fired from my team and my contract thrown in the incinerator. I'm not going to get, what's the term? I'm not going to be sent into excommunicado, from the team, and my family's not going to talk to me anymore. Whatever it might be, like nothing bad is going to happen. Obviously, it's not great for your career if you bomb, but it's not any one game that's going to define you as a player. It's it's typically it's going to be your hardships and how you deal with them that really defines you as a player, as it would any professional. So, one thing is just getting on that grind. Unfortunately, that's one of the most important things for a lot of players. Another important thing as well is really understanding, who you are and, why you're there. I think is a really important thing, because there can be a lot of different psychological elements that can throw people off. One of the ones I suffered with actually was I'm speaking to you right now, where, it goes into that kind of imposter syndrome type of thing I've mentioned on the podcast I did with Jared Tendler, whereby for me, I didn't feel like I necessarily belonged where I did. Of course I did, because I was there. I was good enough and I qualified and I worked hard enough to do that. But I found all these excuses, all these reasons why I didn't belong there. And if you have that feeling, it's going to eat away at you, and you won't ever feel comfortable. You won't ever feel like you're in your element, because you're trying to take yourself out of that element by having an incorrect thought patterns. So, some people, again, can manage with those things and they can just execute regardless. But for others, it can be very impactful. There's a lot of other things that, go into performing on stage as well. And, one of them as well is the ability to be able to reset. And that in of itself is a skill. And there's lots of different tricks, I think, for, trying to apply a mental reset. One that I particularly enjoy is, I forget which tennis player I got this from, but I think it's a tennis player who basically they created this feedback mechanism whereby every time there was a mistake made by this tennis player, he'd slap his thigh, and he would slap his thigh and think about, okay, every time I slap my thigh, it's because I made a mistake, but mistakes are important. Mistakes are me on my path to greatness. For every mistake, I get stronger. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm a human being. But with each mistake, I have an opportunity to show that, I am a champion, and that it's completely fine. And basically, and this is really important in some senses, to have some kind of a process for this, whether it be, if it's in Counter-Strike and you do get that natural downtime to kind of take a breather and take a moment to kind of reset yourself mentally and to prevent poor or let's say deconstructive or let's say destructive thought patterns from happening. You need to be able to remind yourself that you are a human being, that the one mistake is not defining of who you are in your career, that, you're here for the right reasons. You're here because you earned it, because you deserve it. You're here to do a job, and you slowly, get your mind back on the task at hand, if it's necessary to even address some of those things in the first place. Sometimes people can take a bad beat and they can deal with it pretty effectively. Other times it does require a bit more mental work. Again, it depends on the person. Some people inherently have more negative self-talk than others. Some people put a lot of pressure on themselves. Some people don't put enough pressure on themselves. And there's another element at play here as well, because there is no one answer in terms of the self-talk. Because some players, some people, their minds work in a way where they might be very fiery and they may feed off of the pressure. They may feed off of being hyped up and they want to get really energetic. They want to start shouting to their teammates. They want to be all, loud and throw that energy around and, be chanting that, that I'm the best in the world and all this kind of stuff, right? To really force that narrative that I am the best. I'm going to crush everyone, all this kind of stuff. For some people, that's really effective. And for others, it's not so effective because for some people, you may be creating an unrealistic narrative that doesn't make sense. So you don't want to force a narrative that doesn't make sense to you. Again, these things have to resonate with you and the kind of person that you are. For example, there's a reason why Stanislaw doesn't go absolutely mad and get super mega hyped. I mean, look at the guy. That's just not the kind of player and person that he is. He's much more at the outset. I haven't actually had a proper conversation with Stan, but from the outsider, he looks like a very introspective, a deeply analytical person, somebody that's not going to really work well off of pumping themselves up. He doesn't need to do it. He's somebody that's got his eyes, he's focused on the job at hand, and that's how he's going to tackle everything. And he has enough confidence in his preparation. He has enough kind of core belief already, inherent confidence in his ability already. And he has a lot of experience. So that's going to be enough, I think, in his case. And I can't wait to get him on the podcast at some point and I can talk to him about his process for stuff like this. But there are some people that do need to get hyped up. And this is, this is one of the amazing things about playing at the top level is figuring out, what collection of specimens you have on your team, right? Who responds to what? Because it is really important. Because if you do have one guy who has an energy that could potentially be off-putting to other players or vice versa, that can potentially create problems. So you kind of need to understand these dynamics. Did I miss anything? Did I want to mention anything more on this? I think that'll do for now on this topic. This is kind of one of those topics where I actually want to explore it a bit more in detail with certain individuals and you really kind of get into more nitty gritty. But I think that's a decent enough place to leave it for this moment. And we can get on to another question. Thank you very much, Wavepunk. Alejandro Acevedo asks, and again, sorry if I butchered the pronunciation, how can you readjust to playing CS seriously after having taken time off? I think that this question is there's a lot of a lack of information, I would say, for me to answer this one. But I think that one of the things about playing CS seriously, what that part of the sentence means, is a huge time commitment and a level of priority that's going to supersede other things in your life. So, effectively the readjustment is just taking time away from other things, whether that's now suddenly you found yourself single and you have more time to dedicate to the game because of that. Maybe you're having a hiatus with your studies or your work, and that allows you the time to do it. But ultimately, if you're having to readjust to doing it, I don't know if it's really much of an adjustment as it is just moving your priorities around. And in terms of having taken time off, I'm reading in from that you're not ready for these 8 to 10 hour practice days immediately from the outset, and maybe you've also missed out on some of the the way that the meta has changed and everything else like that. So in that instance, I would be saying that you need to be on top of the professional scene. I think picking a few teams or players to follow and taking more, paying more attention and closer attention when you follow their matches can be more informative than trying to watch everything that's happening at once, just because you get to establish a baseline, a foundational understanding of how a team plays. And so when that team plays differently, or when the players play differently, you get more of a sense of what the logic might be behind that, which is more informative than trying to kind of go too wide with the approach in terms of your analysis when you're approaching learning the game after taking time off. And on top of that, definitely one thing that's really interesting to do is if you ever wanted to experiment with your setup, when you come back after a big amount of time off, that's a perfect time to do it because you're already rusty with what you used to use. So it's easier to introduce new things as well as it being the case that it's also easier to deal with the fact that, how should I put it? I mean, you guys know what I'm talking about. Whenever you try to switch settings, there's always this thing in the back of your mind where you're trying to commit to these new settings, this new sensitivity or new mouse or whatever it is, and you're thinking to yourself, I played back. I just want to go back to like feeling good like I used to on my old settings. I know I changed it for a reason, but at least because I'd played so much with that, I know that if I switch back, it would feel like good, for again. And again, I start fragging and stuff. Like to kind of abate that kind of a feeling and diminish it, make it feel less of a thing. Having taken loads of time off, if you decide to suddenly change your settings when you come back, you can't exactly fantasize about how well you used to play on the old settings because you're rusty as hell. So that it helps with that. So I don't know if that really helps to answer your question. I think I would need more information. Okay. Hefe asks, how come I have sick aim in deathmatch but can't hit anything in an actual comp match? Well, I just made a video on my YouTube about that, so you can go find that, and I'll link it. I'll link that directly to you in the comments. Right. Brandon Ken asks, whenever I get flamed for underperforming, I often feel pressured and perform even worse, or just get mad and can't focus. I'm not sure how to combat that. This is a really good question, and I actually touched on this, in fact, in the video I just referenced. Your kind of one of the big problems here as well is that and this might help you in some respects. I would say like 99.9% of people you're probably running into in matchmaking probably have no idea how the game actually works in any level of complexity. So what they're actually doing is they're making a judgment off of an outcome that they don't even really understand in the first place. So not only do they have a poor success metric, they don't even understand why the things that have happened. So they're extremely ignorant. So you're effectively getting somebody that doesn't know what they're talking about, trying to criticize you. And obviously, that's ridiculous, right? It's kind of a ridiculous thing, but it is kind of isolating when you feel like people are being aggressive to you and your team. And that's the last thing you want to feel like when you're playing on a team. You don't want to be in a position where they're isolating you. So instead of wanting to go back on the attack, it's more about nullifying it and also kind of taking it in your stride. And there are various ways to try to do that. And one of the most important things is making the conscious decision that you are the best and most informed critic of your own game. Unless you have like a coach or someone else that you that you trust and you hand that mantle over to, that should always be you. In any discipline in life, you should be the most informed person. If you take anything seriously enough, you should become the student of that thing, and you should be studying it. You're going at your own pace. You're experiencing the journey as you are supposed to experience it, you personally, and no one can really fuck with that. So that's something whereby if you kind of start to instill that mentality and you're doing the work. For me, I always found that gave me a lot of confidence that I knew I was doing the right thing, and I know that I'm on my path, and I'm taking a great degree of care in shaping that path. So that really takes the sting out of it for me with regards to how other people react. And indeed, the other thing too about it is the fact that when you're underperforming, what even is an underperformance? I think one other thing that can be quite helpful is thinking about the game in terms of sample size. This is a very useful trick I got from the poker world when I was playing a lot of poker. Oh man, that was almost 10 years ago now. But one of the ideas is the idea of sample size. Obviously, in Counter-Strike, it doesn't really mean too much, but in the world of poker, obviously, sample size is everything. To test a strategy that would make sense, you have to have a sample size of hundreds of thousands of hands played to see if that strategy actually works in the current meta. And what's interesting to think of it in this sense is the fact that you begin to realize that, much like in poker, Counter-Strike has a huge degree of inherent variance. Again, especially let's say you're solo queuing and matchmaking, let's add more variance. You're selecting maybe one of 3 maps at any given time. You have 9 random people in the game. You have a game in which everything is going to be different probably every single time. There's no 2 Counter-Strike matches that can possibly be the same. And in terms of the way that people move around, the timings, just all of the things that happen, the scenarios that happen, you're playing with imperfect information, so you can't even make decisions consistently. And whenever you're making a guess as to what the best play is, it's kind of like poker as well in terms of putting another player on a range. You're going to make a play based off of your best guess, basically, of what the other people are doing. and you can't necessarily be 100% sure. Yeah, you smoked off a position, but a guy could run through that. A guy could be sitting in the smoke. Maybe he didn't rotate because of that smoke, like people, let's say 90% of the time they do. And that could change everything in the way that you are approaching the round. But you just can't know that. You just have to operate off of the best guess. So there's all these random things happening. And then look at it like this. On top of that, you yourself are going to be inherently inconsistent in your ability to aim. Now, your job in your practice and your preparation is to raise the average. You can't always be at your best, but what you can do is raise the average. And what you can also do on top of kind of consistently over time raising your average, your baseline, you can also look at it. And I think this is such a helpful thing. Again, I'm going to be referencing probably forever the Elige podcasts and the Jared Tendler podcasts, where, you know, they talk about the A game, B game, and C game. And, you know, shout outs to Jared's, who, you know, writes about this in his books, The Mental Game of Poker, which you can get for free in Audible form if you go to Jared Tendler's website, and I think it's /free, I believe. So I think it's like jaredtendler.com/free, something along those lines. You'll find it. It's really easy to find it. And I think I link it in my podcast with him as well in the description on YouTube, so you can find that too. But looking at it in this way, I think it really helps to give clarity to the fact that even if Elige is struggling with having an A game, a B game, and a C game, all the rest of us are going to be as well. And so recognizing that sometimes you are going to be in your kind of your bottom 30%, and sometimes you're going to be in your top 30%. But recognizing those conditions and treating them appropriately, accordingly, is the key in this situation. Because the more familiarity you get, the more reference points you get as to what these different levels are of your own game, the better, the more insights you're going to have as to how you should play. And also the more acceptance you'll experience when you can just be like, you know what, today I'm in my C game, and that's okay. And just understanding that that's part of the process is, I think, very liberating in many respects. It's frustrating at times because you can't control that. But that's another thing that's important, is that we need to recognize the things we can control and can't control. You have to take action on the things you can control, and you have to understand that with the things that you cannot control, you just have to understand how to work around them and just let them exist and be as they are. And that's really important, because if you start to live by, you know, let's say, how did Jared put it? Oh yeah, the illusion of control. If you start to live through the illusion of control, that you think you can control things that you can't control, what it does is it creates expectations that are simply only destined to be destructive and only simply serve to contribute to bad thought patterns in the long term. So, and you're going to run into walls later on doing that. So there are a few things to think about, Brandon, Ken, that could help you. If you have any additional questions on this, I would love to answer them. If just shoot them to me at the Discord, or maybe respond in a tweet, whatever it might be. And because I'm sure there's other things like other areas to this. I mean, this is a great topic. It's a huge topic. Lots of people experience this, and so I might even make something more dedicated to this, which encapsulates even more concepts behind it that could be helpful. But thank you for the question. Right. Reality CSGO asks, how do players deal with brain fog or a period with lack of focus? What do they do to get their head back into the game? I think this question does play into some of the previous things that we talked about, whether that some of the ways in which you kind of deal with pressure, some of the ways in which you mentally reset, and it also kind of goes to Brandon Kenz's question about underperforming and kind of how do you process this? Because again, one of the problems that tends to happen when we underperform is that we compound the problem by obsessing over the fact that we're underperforming, because we have this expectation of what we think we're capable of. And if we don't meet that expectation, then we are sad. And if we don't meet and we put pressure on ourselves because we want to meet that expectation, we're always trying to push towards it. So the expectation there is part of the problem, which is why I was kind of mentioning those previous mentalities, which are healthier and recognize the reality of the situation, as opposed to, again, putting forward this illusion and trying to work from an illusion, which is only destructive in nature. And so, similarly, this is one of those things whereby if you're in that brain fog and you're feeling like you have a lack of focus, the worst thing to do is to try to force it. Sometimes you just are fatigued and you have to respect it. Some days you will just be more fatigued. There is not a magic pill. There's no sensu beans, whatever it is in Dragon Ball Z that you're going to take that and suddenly you're going to pep up. Sure, you can get a bit of sugar in there and try to like bump your energy levels. You can take. There are things where maybe if it's maybe you take a break, you go for a walk, you refresh your mind. One thing that's positive for me, if we're talking, this is the case whereby we're talking about, okay, I get to take a break between matches or something like that, but not mid-match. Then yes, if you go, and I found going and doing something like taking a walk and listening to a podcast, it can be very, very useful because sometimes the fog comes from an over focus. And what I mean by that is that, sometimes you can be so tunnel visioned, you're restrictive of ideas. You're kind of, let's say, dug into certain patterns and ways of thinking, and you hyper focus even more and you just get very dug into one pattern of thinking. And this is a problematic situation because it kind of kills your intuition system from really doing its job, which is intuit things that are happening in an extremely ever-changing environment with a huge amount of variables. So, if you get into that mode, you need a reset because that's going to create bad performances. You're going to just get things wrong a lot of the time. Doing something where you stimulate your mind in a different way and you can kind of like have a focus on other things is a good refresh, I have found personally. But if it is happening during the game, honestly, like sometimes it's just the case that you're too tired to play, and maybe you just hang it up for today and just recognize, hey, I'm too tired to play today. I had this thing for a long time where I decided to kind of regiment my training significantly. Again, I referenced this a bunch of times because it was the last time I played competitively in 2017 when I came into Quake Champions. I had less time to practice and play versus everybody else. So I had to approach my training in a way where I felt like, given everything I've learned up to this point, which is kind of cool for me because I got to test out a lot of stuff I hadn't done before. And I found out that a lot of it worked for me, at least. But what I did was I had this routine where I prioritized above everything else sleep. And so what I would do is I would make sure that understand how much energy I had during the day and make sure that I understood that this is a finite resource and that I'm going to use that in the best way possible. So, and as I mentioned, I think on a previous video, I've done so much content recently, I don't even know anymore which one it was. But I used to go, I would go to the gym first. That'd be one of the first things I would do after having breakfast and maybe doing a little bit of work here, answering emails, all the rest of it. Go to the gym. I have, some various goals in the gym, come back, eat some food, and I wouldn't go too heavy. And then eventually, after maybe an hour or so, after doing a little bit of work whilst I digest, I would sit down and I would do, 30 minutes of practice. I'd have my 15 minutes of technique work, my 15 minutes of warm up, go into some, real game situations, already priming myself with the kinds of problems that I need to work on or the things that I need to, every day there was a goal in that sense, like small goals. And obviously there's the biggest goal, which is to be the best team. The biggest goal is to find ways to beat the teams that at the time didn't seem beatable and understand how to close the distance on those teams. And then I'd be like, okay, maybe playing for like 3 or 4 hours. And I would find that after that 3 or 4 hour period, I would start to feel tired. Maybe it's around like 6 p.m. At that point, I respected the fact that I spent the majority of my good energy that day on the things that I wanted to be the most focused on. And then I did activities that I could get the maximum value out of in a state of being where I didn't have that much energy remaining. So that's stuff like, if I wanted to watch something or if I wanted to read a book or if whatever it might be, and that would be the perfect moment to do it. And the reading was an interesting one, or listening to podcasts, because what you can do is you can make up for the fact that you don't have as much focus or maybe as much retention by writing stuff down. So I had a journal in which I was writing down any notes that I needed from the podcast or the book that I was reading, or the books I was, the podcast I was listening to, or the books I was reading. And so I regimented it like this. I just try to optimize everything and make sure I always had really good sleep, and I'd wake up early in the morning again and do it all over again. And again, this is like a very regimented way to do things, but I was just testing, how can this work? But one of the things that, going back into, the main point here to answer your question, reality, is that I recognize that sometimes you're just tired and you just have to respect it. Oh, and by the way, another thing, when I say I prioritize sleep, that means that I try to make sure that I wasn't using any screens like 2.5, 3 hours before bed. And if I was, then I'd have, flux on with the maximum settings, eradicating all of the blue light if I was going to read the Kindle for like the last hour before I sleep. I'd have it on really low brightness settings and all that kind of stuff, and just making sure I was as least stimulated as possible. I limited caffeine intake, so I wasn't having any caffeine after. The last caffeine I would have would be about noon, like 12, and then it would stop. And I wouldn't have more than like, 1 or 2 cups of coffee during the day. So yeah, I've regimented it a lot to try to like figure this stuff out. I found out that worked for me. But ultimately, what you need to understand is that generally speaking, it's sometimes you won't get your head back into the game, and that kind of sucks. And don't be too frustrated with it. It does happen. Just recognize that you can maybe use that time in better ways, and maybe you can take a break and come back to it. Okay. Next question is from Stronglegs, at Real Stronglegs. This isn't so much about players, but I saw you post a supplement stack on Instagram a while ago. Do you take performance supplements for casting on airtime? Actually, so I do like to, especially, I like to not take anything if I have the luxury of not being jet lagged to high heavens, which obviously happens most of the time because we'll fly in, like we'll do like big international flights, and then if we're lucky, we'll be there 2 days before the broadcast starts, which is still not nearly enough time to obviously deal with the jet lag. And then on top of that, maybe you get the late games or maybe you get the early games. I honestly prefer the early games because it helps you to kind of like, because you're not going to be sleeping that great. And so I just find that helps me to get the best performance. In the late games, you're starting to fall asleep. So those are really difficult to do. So in those situations, I will be using, L-theanine and caffeine for sure. That's my go-to to help me. A lot of hydration is really important. I know that's not a supplement, but making sure that you hydrate like crazy is really critical to help take care of your gut health, as well as taking some other like gut health related supplements. I forget what some of the ones that I was taking were called, but stuff that's kind of more designed towards gut health. I actually asked Taylor Johnson, who's appeared on my podcast a couple of times, he's a sports performance expert, what I should be taking and so on. So I took his advice, and that's where I got the idea for a lot of these supplements. And then when it comes to the sleeping at night, I'd take a stack of a mixture of kava kava, ashwagandha, and melatonin, and that would be my go-to to try to like promote the best sleep. And I would also again try to have the right habits and so on, and try to focus on making sure that I'm exercising at the right times, having eating windows make sense for the time zone that I'm in, and just trying to do whatever I can to not absolutely die of the jet lag. And when I do everything correctly, it sometimes works really well, and sometimes not as well, but definitely way better than if I do everything wrong or do nothing. Because if you do everything wrong, you are absolutely wrecked. Honestly, there's a lot of mistakes you can make, and I see a lot of people making those repeatedly. And there are some people that just don't do anything, which is better than than making some of the bad mistakes. But yeah, it's definitely tough. So that's what I do. I think the exercises is a huge one, though. Like exercising is really big, right? And Bartomi asks, how to deal with poor day performance while mid-game? I consider myself a decent player, 4K hours. I control tilt very well, but sometimes there are days when nothing works out, even if the thought process and decision-making was correct. So this goes back, I think, Bartomi, to what I was talking about in terms of sample sizes and kind of the overall way that you look at the game. And it's good to hear that you control your tilt very well. And ultimately here, I think one of the things that you need to get out of this is understanding that it is part of the process. There's going to be shit days. It is a grind, and there's going to be shit days, but those shit days are really important because they are part of the process. And like you say, even if you have a good thought process and the decision making, you don't disagree with any of the decisions that you made, it's still part of the process. Unfortunately, not any one day is important. It's all of the days added up together cumulatively that's important, and how you spent those days and the time in those days. And I think that one of the ways that we can help to manage any poor day performances, as you're talking about, is, again, if you have the flexibility to kind of alter your training during the day, you can just decide that, I'm actually not playing that well right now today. And I feel like, decision-making and stuff is pretty good, but you know what? I'm not like having a great time here. So you can decide to actually try to spend the time doing something else while in the game still, whether that's some additional technique work, maybe if that's, some demo work, maybe if it's just some stuff that's relating to your team and working with your team, whether it's even just socializing with them or doing something like that. Anything that's good for team chemistry and relationships can be very beneficial to your short-term goals, even if you don't stay with those players for a long time. But it can be definitely a consideration to just switch it up. Because again, one of the things we got to think about is the emotional relationship to the game. And although you say, you control tilt very well, it is important to be having fun with the game. We don't want to lock ourselves too heavily into decision-making patterns. We want to be able to make good decisions, but we don't want to be in decision-making patterns per se. And the reason I say this is because when you're learning a game like Counter-Strike and learning anything really, what you're doing is you're equipping yourself with more and more and more and more tools. You may have just watched a POV demo of how one player anchors a site that you play, and you've learned a few new spots, and then you watch another guy, you learn a few new spots. Then you spent the next 3 months playing all those different spots. You know those spots in and out, all the different options from those spots, and all the rest of it. And each time you learn a new spot, you spend a lot of time focusing on it. You're thinking about it. You're just going there to do that spot. You're doing that thing. But ultimately, what happens is that eventually, once you've really felt that spot out and you understand it, you let it go. And then eventually, you get into this spot where you have all these tools now. So now your brain is in this position where all of your experience cumulatively is going to be used, and then you just make a decision. You make a decision. You don't pick a spot that you watch from some pro player anymore. You pick one of the tools that you've now finally crafted that's in your tool belt to go and deal with that spot as it's arrived to you in that moment off of your intuition. That's where greatness is in many respects. It's accumulating as much knowledge as possible and truly experiencing all of that, and then being able to use that as a perfect response, as opposed to, this is a pretty good spot or a pretty good way to play these kinds of situations, so I'm just going to kind of apply that kind of just because. Those are the kinds of players that don't truly understand the game. And so, if you're in a situation whereby you feel like you're just not having a good time and you're not feeling like anything's all that constructive, then I reckon you should just switch it up and do something else. I would say if you're getting a poor day performance, if it's to that extent. Now, the other way to look at this question as well goes again back to the stuff we talked about with Elige and Jared Tendler, the A game, the B game, the C game. You can use it as an opportunity because everything is effectively an opportunity for one thing or the other, right? Everything in life is opportunity cost in terms of time invested and everything else. So here you could say, well, okay, I'm in my C game. What does my C game look like? What is it? Let's create some reference points. Again, this is going back to an answer of a previous question. And then the thing that you can do there that's very productive is to understand ways you can play when your performance has gone quite as good. And the brilliance behind something like this is that not only are you accepting the fact that it's okay to have a shittier performance, you now have a tool to specifically deal with it, which will make you accept it even better and perform even better. And what that does is it alleviates pressure on you as a player, because you already have accepted the fact that you're playing a little bit worse, and you're like, well, it's cool, I got these things to deal with it, and you're just reacting to the situation as it comes. And this is the most important place to be as a player, is always reacting to what's happening now in the absolute present. You don't want to be thinking to yourself, I'm going to make this play, and then by the time before you can actually start the play, information's changed, the situation's changed, new things have come up, whatever it is. You're just still like, I wanted to make this play. And you're emotionally invested in making that play, and you make it anyway, even though at the back of your mind, you know it's the wrong play. Now, again, that's the sign of a player that doesn't have enough tools, doesn't have enough knowledge. And that's the sign of an unthinking player. So you want to be the thinking player. You want to be the guy that understands how to react to every situation as it occurs. And that's something that also translates to, various score lines. If you're facing a huge deficit, the other team could win any round. I mean, well, does it really matter? Like, you're just playing another game. Like, you have this much money, you're in this situation, these are the things you've observed. Like, you can kind of remove that from the equation. The end score doesn't really matter, because you're only ever trying to win one round when you're playing Counter-Strike. So what's the best way to go and win that round? And that's what you're trying to work out every single time. And so that needs to be the obsession. As soon as we can kind of like find different ways, and it's different for everybody, how we can kind of like finagle a way to kind of change the success criteria, we can actually start to have, just generally better mindsets and thought patterns. And and you'll have a much different sense of how you even assess yourself as a player. So, okay. With that, I think there was one more question that was in my Discord. So I'm going to try to find it real quick. And here it is. I think this could be a big one. Let's have a look. Steve asks, I have an incredibly vague question for you. I know that you've given this area a lot of thoughts. Like me, most people never think about mouse technique. By the time they think about it, how that could affect performance, they've already been using a mouse for many years. Everything they do is purely intuitive and analyzed habit. So what would a person in that situation want to think about in terms of beginning to analyze their mouse technique? What's important? What are major do's and don'ts? What are the most common mistakes you see people make? Okay, so this is a pretty big question. So this will definitely be the one to close on. Okay, so I think I did some answers to this in another recent video. Again, it's all blurring together at this point, doing so much content around this stuff. But I think one of the things about a mouse is, first of all, you have to understand what grip you intuitively move towards. And one learning tool that's really useful is looking at evidence from other people that may have a similar grip, and looking at the ways in which they use their mouse, and being open as well that if you really want to mix things up, you can decide to actually be like, okay, I'm going to change my grip. Now that can be potentially an issue, but generally speaking, I have to say one of the things that I've learned is that most people actually intuitively use a grip that's good for them. What may not be intuitively good for them is necessarily the mouse or maybe the surface that they're using based on various anatomical considerations. For example, let's say I'll take myself an example. I'm a wrist player and I naturally was using my wrist predominantly when I was young, but I used to use heavy, big right-handed mice. These are the wrong mice for me. As soon as I found a smaller, ambidextrous, lighter mouse, suddenly I realized, because I was using the same grip, it's like, oh, okay, well, the mouse itself didn't quite fit with the way that the size of my hand is, the kind of the range that I'm operating with from a wrist player perspective. Obviously, if you're a palm player, there's a lot more. I think it's a little bit less finicky. That said, this is coming from a person that's predominantly been a wrist-based player. So I do think, though, that even if you've instilled some habits that have become intuitive over time, I think everybody's capable of learning new techniques. If you decide to make a switch to your grip, you just have to be very concerted in your effort to cement that habit in place. And in this situation, if you're trying to analyze things, again, go to the pros that use the same grip and look at the way pros use mice that you're using, and just look at, and then kind of compare the grips and so on. Use that as a baseline to work from, and start to kind of understand by looking at self-diagnosing through using aim trainers. Where are you weak exactly in the aim trainer? And that's a really important thing, because if you're weak in flicking or tracking or whatever it might be, then that is another clue as to what may or may not be wrong, whether it be mouse or grip related. And without kind of, I think this is also one of those things as well, though, where for me, I want to kind of look at someone's specific situation, and I think I can usually have a good idea as to what a really good adjustment for them might be, just given my own personal experiences and experimentation. But there's the key right at the end there. The personal experimentation is one of the most informative tools. And again, as I said before, everything is about knowledge, and the more knowledge that you have, the more things that you try, will give you more knowledge. The more tools you have, and the more of an overall picture you'll have as to how everything works and what does and does not work for you. And then eventually all those experiences and experimentation will lead you in the right direction. And I think that's probably a good place to leave it. Again, this is a really big question. I kind of don't want to get super stuck into it. I think I'll save this one to answer more thoroughly to its own video, because there's also a question that I answered that speaks to this as well in my Changing Your Settings podcast, which you can find on my YouTube or any podcast app. I think it's literally called Changing Your Settings. And that's about understanding what are the good reasons to change your setup and what are the bad reasons to change your setup, and to help you guys to kind of figure out whether you're making a change in good faith or in a way that makes sense, or a way that doesn't make sense. But on that note, I will sign this one off. Thanks for listening. Cheers. And also thanks for questions. Cheers.